This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our 5th Afghanistan Luncheon took place on February the 13th. Our keynote speaker was RCMI's Director of Defense and Security Studies, Dr. Dan Eustace, a veteran of the Afghan War, with a special appearance by resident war artist Gertrude Kearns.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's especially significant to be here today as my exhibition of Afghanistan works coincides with the Afghanistan Luncheon. So I think this is the 4th luncheon I've attended. As you can see, we're surrounded on 3 sides by portraits of CAF veterans of Afghanistan. That mission predominates both the exhibition on the 4th and 5th floors, which I hope you'll see, and the video we're going to watch in a couple of minutes. There are 31 works in this show, created between 2006 and 2025. About a third of the entire Army-centric body of work that I started upon finishing my TFA Rota Zero contract in 2006. Early that year, I was embedded in uniform in Kandahar. That job was for 6 canvases, 3 by 4 foot each, which I developed back in Toronto. After which, I couldn't let go of the mission. It totally consumed me. I wanted to consider it more broadly, in more depth, to attempt an address of the scope and weight of your efforts. After much deliberation, I decided Senior Command offered particular vantage points from which to explore things, both operationally and conceptually. 12 years later, the series concluded with JTF2 in 2018. People always assume that I've been commissioned to do this work. I was paid to be in Afghanistan and do those 6 campuses. However, this has all been independent in every way. I selected my own subjects, which provoked some ire along the way, and I controlled the direction of the series. The video we'll see synopsizes the last 20 years of my CAF-related work. It starts with studio shots during COVID and moves to this same exhibition that was in Washington at our Canadian Embassy just this last fall. It shows works in progress, text deliberations, and tech digital capture printing, the whole process towards the final, which really is about the works on the 5th floor. You might wonder why General David Petraeus is in this room in that prime location. He's my only U.S. subject in the series, as he was the driving force behind the U.S. counterinsurgency manual, which influenced our approach. He also adds a command chain dimension. Things with our neighbor to the south were already tenuous last summer when I first asked him by email whether he was comfortable with his portrait being first at our embassy in Washington and then here at the Military Institute. His rapid reaction in response to my email, "You bet, Gertrude." General Carignan is one of the newer heads in the series, but the Canadian War Museum, who purchased it, couldn't extend its loan to RCMI after the embassy. Otherwise, she'd be in this room. However, there are 2 large format works of her on the 5th floor, text image works, along with pieces that look into the conceptual nature of the mission as well as the legal, and new sovereignty works. I hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.
So we are very fortunate to have Trudy, such talent, as our RCMI Honorary War Artist. And Trudy, that was a really fantastic video. Initially, Trudy always attends the Afghanistan Luncheon, and of course, we were surrounded by the portraits, and I figured she had to say something. But then she told me about the video, and I saw the video, and it's fantastic. So hopefully you enjoyed it. But it certainly shows her level of talent and her dedication to this particular project. And I hate to use the word, but starving artist might sometimes be appropriate, since she had to really basically fund a lot of this herself. So well done, Trudy. Thank you very much for the presentation. And now we come to our guest speaker, Major Daniel Derek Eustace, CD, PhD, retired. Following a 30-year career as a senior infantry officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, with extensive national and international experience in both the reserve and regular forces, Dr. Eustace continues to support the Canadian defence and security sectors as Director of the Royal Canadian Military Institute's Defence and Security Studies Program. In addition, he provides sessional on-live instruction for professional military education and undergraduate and graduate level academic courses for the Royal Military College Department of Defence Studies at the Canadian Forces College. Dan is a graduate of the Canadian Armed Forces Land Command and Staff College, the Canadian Forces College, the National Defence College, the U.S. Joint Forces Staff College, and the Senior Executives in National and International Security Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Canadian History and Politics from York University, a Master of Arts in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada, and a Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations from the National University of Ireland. Dr. Eustace is the recipient of several honors and awards, including the General Campaign Star with Afghanistan Bar, the Ministry of Veterans Affairs Commendation, the Order of St. John, and the Queen Elizabeth II Golden and Jubilee Medals. He served as aide-de-camp for the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario from 1999 to 2014. Dan has been a member of the RCMI since 1988 and was appointed as the RCMI's Director of the Defense and Security Studies Program in 2016. I give you Dr. Dan Eustace.
Don't worry, I'm not going to read this entire book to you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we cross the line of departure, I think it would be appropriate for us just to take a moment of silence to think about those people who were killed and injured in Tumbler Ridge in BC on Tuesday. Could I ask you just to bow your heads and we'll take a moment of silence? Thank you. Thank you very much. So today I've titled my presentation as Looking in the Rearview Mirror. I want to thank you for attending the 5th Annual Afghan Luncheon. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be your speaker. I'm actually surprised at this because in speaking with Mike Hoare, Mike, as you know, is the fellow that started this a few years back. There was a bit of an interruption over COVID, and at the last minute he found himself needing a speaker, and I've yet to learn not to put up my hand and volunteer for something. You just never seem to get over that. I'm very pleased to see General Habibi here today. It's a great honor to have you with us. Thank you so much. I'll try to provide some interesting and hopefully thoughtful material in keeping with the purpose of the event, which has already been mentioned, I believe, is to honor our fallen and remember those who continue to struggle both physically and mentally as a result of their service to Canada and the citizens of Afghanistan. Now, today's kind of an interesting day to be doing this. It's Friday the 13th, if anybody has forgotten about that. but it's also the first day of the Munich Security Conference. And this is going to be a very, very significant event. I believe that Prime Minister Carney has delayed his attendance there. I'm not even sure he's going to be able to go there because I think he's going to a vigil tonight out in British Columbia for the very same event that we have just recognized. So a very interesting day. Let me get underway then. I'm not going to waste a lot of your time, but let me start with this. So if you're an academic, you have to have a hypothesis about something. And so this is my hypothesis for today. I'll let you take a moment to read it. So this is the outline for today. I don't need to read it to you. I'm going to use that model, that three-lens perspective of analytical, experiential, and theoretical to ground the comments that I'm going to make. And during my talk, what I'm asking you to think about is to reflect on your own experience. I mean, look at the experiences in this audience right now. Those who served, those who did not serve. In Afghanistan, it is irrelevant in that sense, but a tremendous amount of experience is present here today. So maybe as you're sitting here and you're listening to me for the next little while, you'll think about your own experience, perhaps in that same way. A couple of rules of engagement. First is I'm going to try to keep to the timing, which should be about 45 minutes. If I go any longer than that, please feel free to throw something at me. And the second point I want to make is that somewhere in the middle, I want to talk about the sensitive subject of the repatriation of the fallen. And you'll understand why I'm going to talk about that when I get there. But I'll give you a heads up when I approach that. If you're not comfortable with me discussing that, please feel free to go for a comfort break. I'll give you a few moments to leave the room. I won't be talking about it for very long, but I understand that can be a very uncomfortable subject for a lot of people for obvious reasons. So don't be uncomfortable about that. If you're feeling the need to leave the room, then by all means do so. Okay, so we'll get underway. So the analytical phase one, you can see that I was involved in a number of appointments in Canada, in Germany, in The Hague, and in Joint Force Command Brunson over a period of about 5 years. Now, for each of these three phases, I have posed questions that I was asking myself. I'm not going to necessarily answer all those questions here because we don't have enough time, but I just want to give you an insight into sort of the thinking that I approached these three lenses with the questions I had in my mind. And I am going to touch on some of these for sure. But first, I want to take you to Staff College. Who here is a graduate of the Canadian Forces College or equivalent? Okay, we've got some people in the room. Now you can keep me honest, okay, because I may say something silly. But the reason I want to do this is because I am going to talk a lot about the operational level of warfare, and I'm going to talk a lot about the military strategic level. So there's the operational level of war right there, and there's the military strategic level, okay? I am going to be talking about that, so I just want to make sure for those of you who may have not perhaps seen something like this before, that you're going to be comfortable. I don't want to leave anybody behind, okay? So welcome to Staff College. These are the levels of warfare, and I will be making reference to this as we go forward. So this is important. Look at the operational level just for a second. Campaign planning and theater operations, okay? But we'll get through this. Now, when I was working at the Canadian Forces College in 2003, I was moved from a role as a land element curriculum developer, otherwise known as a planner, to the Department of Exercises and Simulation. The primary task of that department was to design and execute major exercises for what was then called the Command and Staff Course and the National Security Studies Course, now the JCSP and the NSP. Both of those courses, by the way, have been frequent visitors now back down here, thanks to Mike Clary and company, and I think they really enjoyed visiting the RCMI. those folks sometimes would be up there, they'd be posted there for an entire year and never have a chance to come down and see this place. And when they do, it basically blows their minds because they just don't realize what we have here as in this facility. It's incredible. Now, in this context, the CFC operational analysts, of which I was one, and we had land, air, maritime, and logistics analysts, supported the final war game during the CSC final exercise. As a land operational analyst, I was trained to use a software application called Lambda, and this relied on formulas that included such things as weapon systems data, force sizes, frontages, and other variables. It was simply a force-on-force model and had been in use for some time. Now, by 2003, the college had gained a situation of mutual cooperation and support with the NATO school, which is in Oberammergau. We would support the NATO operational planning course at the NATO school in Oberammergau, Germany. I went there about 20 times. And the OAs from what's called the NATO Consultation Command and Control Agency, otherwise known as NC3A, would come to CFC to support our final X. Now, that same year, NATO adopted a new synthetic scenario, which was called the Zoran C, which focused on an Afghan kind of problem involving insurgents backed up by a large anti-NATO country. As a result, while the maritime, air, and logistics simulations that were in use were still viable in the new scenario, the land application no longer made sense. This is a picture here of a war game that's occurring. It's a manual war game. Now, I just want to highlight for you the fact that wargaming is situated here in the operational planning process, and what we were doing mostly in that activity was the course of action wargame, testing courses of action, identifying strengths and weaknesses, and assessing risks. The point of this is that the students had a limited amount of time to conduct these war games, usually less than a day. And they would develop 3 courses of action that they would propose to the commander, and the commander then would presumably select one, or he might ask to merge 2 of them together, or he might reject all 3 of them and say, get back to the drawing board. But because they only had enough time to war game 2 courses of action out of the 3 that they developed, we would step in as operational analysts and war game the 3rd one using our simulation tools, and then provide them with the output. So during 2004, I worked with a German operational analyst from NC3A to design and implement and develop a new application which we called Zeta, which was based on the Zoran C scenario that I mentioned. So this application provided the opportunity to support wargaming in the context of an asymmetric conflict. It could simulate many different elements, including the effects achieved by the insertion of NATO troops into a host nation, the improvement or not on the host nation forces, and the degradation of insurgent attacks, etc. Now, the lesson learned here is that the courses of action developed by students in the exercise focused on deployment of NATO forces. It also assumed that once sufficient numbers of NATO troops were deployed, the problems facing the host nation would simply vanish. In other words, their focus was on deployment rather than on employment. It's not hard to see how this became a fallacy later on in the real-life situation in Afghanistan. The deployment phase in this scenario would generally be about 2 to 4 weeks, and as you can see, while the insurgents would become increasingly ineffectual, that's the red line decreasing, the model shows that the host nation government would require approximately 6 months to gain a higher level of effectiveness. Okay, that is the blue line. The real 3 options that the students needed to consider was 1, have NATO focus on the insurgents, 2, have NATO focus on supporting and training the host nation forces so that they could focus on the insurgents, or both. The selected COA would then define the size and composition of the necessary force package to accomplish that mission. Consider how this all played out in real life later on in Afghanistan. So this is just an output chart. You can see on the left-hand side various data points that we could track, and this was information that we would glean from working with the students while they're developing their courses of action. And then across the bottom, you can see the timeline, which reaches out in this case to approximately 24 weeks. Now, by 2005, Zeta was mature enough for use in an upcoming NATO multinational experiment, which was called Multinational Experiment 4. I was invited to join the NC-38 team in The Hague to prepare Zeta for use in that experiment, and the experiment scenario was, in fact, Afghanistan, and I would be tasked as chief of the effects-based assessment cell during that experiment in Istanbul. The experiment ran from 27 February to March 17, 2006, and the experimental nature was twofold. The NATO headquarters was distributed globally with various cells linked into another new application called TOPVAS, Tool for Operational Planning Force Activation System. The main EBA planning, operations, intelligence, and assessment cells were located in Istanbul. In addition, NATO wanted to experiment with the relatively new effects-based approach to operations, EBAO, in spite of the fact that the US had already rejected EBO earlier on, effects-based operations. The EBAO construct replaced the Napoleonic headquarters construct, the 1-to-9 construct you may be familiar with 1 personnel, 2 is intelligence, 3 operations, 4 logistics, and so on. But they were replaced with EBAO cells. The Istanbul site for the experiment was an oddly named place. It was called the Ataturk Wargaming and Convention Center, something we might want to think about in Canada. It had a huge theater on the main level and multiple spaces for wargaming and other military uses on the upper level. It was also redeveloped and is now known as the Multinational Joint Warfare Center. Now here's the lesson learned for me. As the experiment was drawing to a close, all the cell chiefs were tasked to brief the 4-star commander regarding results. And I had to brief him on my assessment of what I thought had occurred during the experiment. Now, the operational task was very similar to what we simulated at the college and the NATO school, which was the introduction of NATO forces into a different and larger region of Afghanistan in order to quell an insurgency and improve living conditions and the effectiveness of the government. Not surprisingly, given the short time frame that was simulated during the experiment, my assessment was that virtually no improvements were identified. After my brief to the commander, he stated it was clear that my model was completely useless and that no amount of data could have override the most important factor for success, which was his gut feelings. I was in no position to dispute this, but I recalled this moment at a later time when other commanders would make similar assertions, and to no one's surprise, the results were sometimes disastrous. From The Hague, I was moved to the Joint Force Command Brunssum in the Operational Analysis Department. My task was to study and review the campaign assessment methods, tools, and organizations that were supporting ISAF, ISAF being, of course, the NATO headquarters in Afghanistan. The process that was underway at the time was embedding operational analysts at the regional command level, then rolling up the regional command data for consolidation at the ISAF level, and then transmitting that data to us in the OA department at Joint Force Command Brunssum. This data would then be reviewed and massaged into a monthly report to the commander of JFCB in an attempt to, in effect, tell him how well the campaign was going. The data collected was related to the ISAF campaign plan, and this involved tracking approximately 300 different data points. Many of those data points were non-military in nature, such as the rule of law, collection of taxes, number of schools built, etc., etc. And 2 problems were evident. The rotation of personnel out at the regional command and sub-regional command levels, i.e. national levels. Those were people who had developed local trusted sources and now were going to be replaced with personnel who did not have those same kinds of connections. So there was a gap there. The other problem was with the ISAF commanders themselves, who would rotate in and decide that he was not interested in tracking certain data points and wanted to add new ones. Thus, the overall information picture was constantly changing and frankly not very accurate. Now, here's a lesson learned for me. If any of you here today worked at Joint Command JCSB, you may totally disagree with my next comment. Overall, I did not find that JCFB headquarters could actually affect what was happening on the ground in Afghanistan. I came to understand that while the commander, ISAF, who was always a 4-star American, technically reported to the commander of JFCB, who, when I was there, was a 4-star German, the commander of ISAF would frequently bypass JFCB and communicate directly with SACEUR and Mons. SACEUR is Supreme Allied Commander Europe, always a 4-star US general. Now, much of the commentary that accompanied the monthly ISAF reports centered on what additional assets ISAF needed. More tactical aviation, more hospitals, more troops, and so on. And JFCB had no ability to force generate any of these things. This had to be done at the NATO level in order to make the requests to the nations who own those assets. As such, JFCB acted primarily as an unwieldy communication node, or frankly, I could call it a mailbox. My final report to the JFCB commander was entitled Best Practices for Campaign Assessment and Associated Analysis Support, and this was later used as one of the inputs to the new NATO assessment doctrine. Phase 2, experiential. Again, have a read and take a look at some of the things that I was involved with during this phase. Now that I'm back in Canada from my work with NATO, I was appointed as Deputy Commanding Officer of an organization called Land Force Area Troops. This unit did not actually exist. It was stood up for a specific purpose of force generating psychological operations operators and civil military cooperation operators that would deploy with the Canadian task forces. The personnel selected were all reservists and were drawn from across Ontario. There was a rigorous selection process and about a 6 to 8 month training period. So it was a very significant commitment for those reserve soldiers to make. A couple of quick notes about the PSYOPs and CIMIC functions. PSYOPs itself is not new, and most militaries maintain that capability. The fact that it was delegated to the reserves meant that the regular force either didn't have the capacity to take it on due to their own force generation issues at that time, or that it was not a capability that would be considered enduring once the Canadian mission was completed. And indeed, my unit would be disbanded following the 2010 withdrawal of Canada from Afghanistan. That said, we had at the time a very significant training budget. And one of the things we did is we placed PSYOPs trainees into Toronto-based marketing and advertising companies. They learned the various techniques that they use to influence people, and today that's what we would call them. We'd call them influencers. And so they learned those techniques on the ground in the real civilian world. Now, one interesting PSYOPs capability that our unit did not own, but we did leverage, was Radio Rana. Has anybody heard of Radio Rana? Okay, so Radio Rana was located in a secret location in Canada, Kingston, and it broadcasted popular Afghan music into Afghanistan directly from Kingston. And Afghan DJs were recruited and were part of a deliberate program to support NATO and the Afghan government. Once we left Afghanistan, that whole operation was put away, put into a box, and went into storage. We haven't used that capability since, but we have the ability to do it anytime we wish to do. Regarding civil military cooperation, just a point here, we actively recruited females into the CIMIC function because it's critical for communications with villagers, as I'm sure that you know. Now, this is the point at which I'm giving you a heads up about my topic about repatriation of the fallen. If anybody wants to take a short break, please feel free to do that. Right, so before I share a couple of war stories from my time in theater, I want to make note of a very important task that was given to my unit, and that is supporting the repatriation process. And this is, as I said, the heads up I referred to earlier. Now, the specific task that we were given was to provide escorts to the escort of the fallen. So while you probably know that when we experienced a death in theater, McKinnon and Bowes dispatched 2 mortuary technicians to theater to retrieve the remains. But in addition, a soldier from the fallen's unit would also return to Canada in order to assist with the mortuary duties, such as helping with uniform and accoutrements. And that escort would have also gathered up the fallen's personal effects in order to bring them to the family. Now, the escort may have been in combat with the fallen only a short time before. And now, a short time later, he or she would be landing in Canada and being greeted by dignitaries such as you see here. At the same time, he would be meeting with members of the fallen's family, friends, and colleagues. They would be asking a lot of questions. Now, our job was to immediately make contact with that escort and remain with him until such time as the body left Toronto for transport to the final resting location. In all, we undertook this unfortunate responsibility far too many times, but it was a deep privilege to do so. In 2008, I deployed to Afghanistan, where I was tasked to be an ISAF-based counter-IED trainer. When I arrived on the appointed day of the ISAF headquarters in Kabul, I was introduced to a U.S. Lieutenant Colonel who was chief of the ISAF counter-IED branch. He asked me why I was late. I said I was not late. I'm here to take over from Major Bloggins as a CID trainer. He said, no, you are taking my position as the chief, so you'd better sit down because I'm leaving in 2 hours and you have a lot to learn. So it began. Now, most of you who deployed to Afghanistan no doubt have many stories to tell about your time there, and I do as well. But I must respect the time limit we've set for ourselves, so I will only share 2 very strange experiences that I had. The ISAF headquarters counter-ID branch had the task of functioning as the regional command center, in other words, Kabul counter-IED response force. As a result, we maintained a small fleet of Humvees which were outfitted with jamming equipment, this to prevent IED attacks using radio control technology and some other methods. The counter-ID branch commander was a full U.S. full colonel, who also had the role with the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization, which was based in the United States, and so he was away from the ISAF headquarters for long periods of time. The Branch 2 IC was a Canadian lieutenant colonel, no names, no pack drill, and I know he's not here today, otherwise I couldn't tell this story, who had apparently spent some time in the Special Forces and appeared to be somewhat frustrated that he was deployed to Afghanistan in essentially an administrative sort of role. One day, he brought the entire branch to a meeting and explained that he had been contacted by someone in the Afghan National Police Force who requested our support for an important operation. Evidently, the high-ranking members of the Taliban who had been captured and were now located in Pawlacharki prison, which is located on the outskirts of Kabul, had managed to acquire telecommunications and radio equipment and were using it to control operations outside of the prison. The ANP wanted to move all of the prisoners from one side of the facility to the other so that the guards could go into the cells and remove the communications equipment. Well, that sounds pretty easy. So he said, tomorrow afternoon we'll take 4 of our CID vehicles to the prison while that operation is underway, and that way the prisoners will not be able to communicate with their fellow Taliban fighters on the outside. So long story short, I was tasked to be the co-driver with the U.S. Air Force captain, and off we went to the prison. And we had our counter radio gear all fired up. It wasn't long before the prisoner move got underway. Now, we sat there for several hours before it dawned on me that we were missing something really important. Orders. When were we supposed to leave? We did have communications with the main ISAF radio channel, but not to the CID branch, specifically a really dumb move on my part. By now it was pitch black and we were debating about the next move when the radio chirped up and a voice stated, quote, that we have a credible report that the Taliban are aware of the prisoner move and that they may be planning to attack the prison to set everyone free. The point of the attack has been assessed as the West Wall. At which point I casually asked my captain, say, which wall do you think we're parked at? Certainly it's the West Wall, sir, I'm sure of it. I said, by the way, do you know how to use the 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the top of this Humvee? He said, no, not at all, but there's no ammo on board anyway, so it doesn't really matter. At this point, we got out of there at a very high rate of speed. Now, the next morning, I assumed that the lieutenant colonel in question that set up this mission would be court-martialed or something, but no one had said a word. It was as if it had never happened. Did I just really dream it? But no, I could look at my phone and there was the photographs that I had taken during that period of time. One very important mission for the counter-ID training cell was to generate what we call level 1 counter-ID operators. There were in fact 3 levels in this construct. Level 1 operators were the initial personnel who would respond to and investigate an IED event. Now that may be a find, a report, or an actual attack. These operators did not need to be engineers or any other specialist trade. Frequently they were infantry or armored personnel who were selected by their units to be trained as level 1 operators. The training included such skills as interviewing witnesses, photography, gathering evidence, and writing appropriate reports. All of this information would be passed to the ISAF counter-ID intelligence cell, which in turn would pass it on to the level 2 laboratory, which was operated by the US at Bagram. Following analysis in that location, the information and any physical evidence would be sent to the Level 3 laboratory, which at the time was the former forerunner to the current JIADO, which was the overall in the United States. The overall objective here, of course, was to determine the origin of the IED and hopefully the specific bomb maker. One major concern was the potential for IEDs to be made outside of the theater by countries such as Iran. The final test to pass the Level 1 course was participation in a field exercise, which incorporated a number of stands. The students would rotate through each stand and would be evaluated on how they dealt with whatever the stand presented. Again, this could be a find, a report, or the evidence of an actual IED attack. On the morning of the exercise, in order to simulate attacks, we had the French engineers wire up 3 vehicles of various types and then blow them apart. This all happened on one of the training ranges near the Afghan Army training base on the outskirts of Kabul. Because this area was essentially a wide open space with no physical security measures, we tasked the Turkish battalion, which was the Regional Command Center security force, to create a security perimeter with their armored personnel carriers around our training range. As the exercise began, I wanted to take photos for our after-action course report, and the photo you see here is the only one that I was able to take. Moments after this, 2 explosions occurred very close to where we were working, and I asked my Australian colleague what had just happened. Didn't the French finish the job this morning? He then replied and said, "Listen, do you hear that?" I said, "What am I listening for?" He said, "Those are live rounds going overhead." At which point I stopped the exercise immediately and had everyone go to ground. I told my sergeant major to contact the Turks and have them come in and load everyone up on the APCs for cover. I then tried to contact range control on the radio, but there was no response. So my sergeant major and I got into our own Humvee and took off for range control. When we arrived and went in, there was no one to be found. So we yelled out, and a minute or so later, a frankly rather elderly U.S. civilian walked in and wondered what our problem was. I went over to the map on the wall and said, "Look, you know our exercise is right here, and we appear to be experiencing live rocket and rounds coming into our direction. What is going on?" He said, "Well, yeah, your range is here, but just over that crest, there are some folks there getting in some range work there, and I suspect the rounds are bouncing off that crest." I said, "Well, for God's sakes, man, tell them to cease fire immediately." He said, "Well, I can't. I don't have contact with them." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, you know, they're 3-letter agencies, CIA, FBI, and the like." So we immediately got back to the range. Everyone had been safely loaded into the vehicles, and we had no choice but to leave the exercise behind. The next day I wrote, not surprisingly, a scathing report to higher, but never received a response. We were very lucky indeed, but the pattern of no action was an ongoing concern for the rest of my tour, and I termed this the cowboy syndrome. The theoretical phase. I would say this phase certainly was from 2011 to the present day. I mean, arguably, I'm standing here in front of you today and have other questions. Following my Afghan tour, I returned to Canada and another short stint in LFCA troops, this time as the CO. I was posted to the Afghanistan Task Force High Readiness Cell in the Directorate of Army Training after that as a collective training plans officer. This job involved the development of new collective training plans in anticipation of the Canadian mission change out from a kinetic role to security force capacity building, and quite frankly, preparing the Canadian bases for withdrawal from theater. It was interesting work primarily because we had no real idea as to which troops would remain entirely in secure locations versus those who would need training to go outside the wire with the Afghan forces we were accompanying on their training missions. In the end, I think we got the balance right. After just 1 year in Kingston, I was posted to the college for the 3rd time, and this time I was responsible for developing and executing a series of exercises for the National Security Program. This was an excellent opportunity for me to continue working on my doctoral thesis that I had started 3 years earlier. CFC has an excellent resource center with a very helpful and knowledgeable staff, so gaining access to books and other material was easy. The job itself was very busy at times, then very quiet at others, so I had plenty of time to research and continue writing my thesis. By 2014, I had completed it and was granted a PhD in International Relations from the National University of Ireland. I'll come back to this in a moment. But I want to note that as a result of this, I was transferred from exercises and simulation to the academic department as a full-time instructor. This was a case where I was technically, quote, in uniform, but didn't actually wear one, in keeping with a couple of previous officers who had also worked as academics at the college, but were still working on their doctorates. While I did sense some reluctance to this arrangement on the part of some other civilian academics, it finally dawned on me that because I was still a CAF member, the academic department was getting me for free, so to speak, and they could therefore offload a full course load with no budgetary impact. Always learn to follow the money. I would only like to share one interesting fact related to my time instructing the NSP. As you're probably aware, the National Security Program is the last full-time professional military education course that a senior officer can take, and it's designed for full colonels and those destined to become GOFOs, generals or flag officers for the naval folks. As such, the students have already had a very successful career at unit level and have had appointments such as base commander in keeping with their colonel or equivalent ranks. Now, there was an interesting pattern I noted. Many of the students were, to put it politely, complainers. Nothing was good enough at the college. Nothing good was happening in the Canadian Armed Forces. I would say that I could describe them as jaded. They'd seen it all, and they'd done it all. And then something interesting would happen. They would graduate from the course, and many would indeed be promoted to brigadier general or commodore. Then, 1 or 2 years later, they would be asked to return to the college to provide a briefing of some sort to the next cohort of NSP students, and suddenly a miracle happened. Now it was the best of all possible worlds. The CAF is amazing, and everything is going exactly according to plan. I'm not sure what was in the Kool-Aid, but the view from the top looked very different indeed from what it was when they were in school. Following my retirement, I continued to instruct for CFC and took on my role here at the RCMI. And as well, as a result of contacts I made earlier in my career, I also had opportunities to consult with other CAF organizations, and I'll share one last experience with you before wrapping up. In 2016, what was called the Director General Space was transferred to the RCAF from the Vice Chief's office. Between 2016 and 2018, the RCAF did not make any attempts to integrate DG Space into the Air Force. And in that year, the RCAF commander tasked the Royal Canadian Air Force Warfare Center in Trenton to stand up a space operational planning team to provide the commander with options for DG Space. I was invited as an infanteer, no less, to be part of the SOPT. Because of my background, I was tasked with what we called environmental mapping. So what is environmental mapping? Well, there's the description right there. Okay, why was this important and necessary to the project? Very simply, it was determined that while DG Space was a distinct node within the RCAF and the CAF more broadly, it had many kinds of relationships with many other organizations, and depending on which organizational option or course of action the commander selected, which was more or less on a spectrum of greater or lesser degrees of integration into the RCAF, many of these relations would need to be amended. In many cases, the relationships had never been formalized, i.e. there were no service level agreements, no contracts, or other written direction and guidance. So figuring out what those relations were about was no small feat. I'm not going to describe this graphic in detail, but you can see, if I can find this little button again. There it is. You can see that DG Space is this guy here, and it has relations with other government departments, other organizations within the Canadian Armed Forces, other departments in the government more broadly, and the green circles representing international organizations, and a very strong relationship with the US STRATCOM, particularly the Combined Space Operational Center. Now, at the end of the project, the RCF commander was presented with our options paper, and for a period of time, everything went into a kind of information black hole. Then in July of 2022, the stand-up of the 3rd Canadian Division was announced. Now, one of the key observations that we had noted in our work was the fact that at the time it was not possible for Canadian Armed Forces personnel to stay within the space realm on a permanent basis, and it was necessary for them to be posted back to their formal MOC in order to get qualified for further promotion. This meant that DG Space was continually losing its most experienced personnel, but with the new space division in place, this dilemma has apparently been solved, which is a good thing. So, as I went through this discussion, and looked in the rearview mirror, here are the key lessons learned that I mentioned in passing. Deployment versus employment with Zeta, the commander's gut feeling from MNE4, campaign assessment technical issues that we discovered at Joint Force Command Brunson, a command and control ineffective bureaucracy at the same location, my work with PSYOPs and CIMIC, and the repatriation process proved once again the reserve forces' creativity, flexibility, and dedication. We uncovered a cowboy syndrome in theater where people didn't want to necessarily follow the rules or wanted to color outside the lines. The view from the top from the National Security Program, and the positive possibility to affect strategic decisions that I discovered through the SOPT. Now, allow me to wrap up this presentation with a final word about my thesis, which I completed in 2014. You might not be able to read the title, so I will. The title is State Building as Strategy and Interrogation of NATO's Comprehensive Approach in Afghanistan between 2006 and 2011. This thesis was the result of 5 years of research and writing, but I hope you understand now that it really represents the culmination of work and experiences I had gained over a period of time extending back to at least 2003, some 11 years earlier. There were 5 questions that I was trying to answer in this paper. 1. What was the comprehensive approach, where did it come from, and why was it viewed as a viable strategy to address fragile, failing, and failed states? 2. Why did NATO choose to adopt the comprehensive approach as its primary strategy in Afghanistan? 3. What evidence may be identified to argue that the strategy failed? 4. If the evidence for failure is compelling, is it possible to understand why the strategy failed in the Afghan setting? And 5. What are the implications for this failure for the alliance going forward? For me, the evidence for the failure of the strategy I found was compelling and was based on an analysis of both the ISAF campaign plan and the Afghan National Development Strategy. Over that decisive period of time, 2006 to 2011, when the comprehensive approach to state building was NATO's formal strategy to address a multitude of challenges in Afghanistan, there was no appreciable improvement in any of the measures of performance or effectiveness, and in fact, some measures, such as poppy eradication, actually deteriorated. Final word. Donald Trump's statement about NATO and Afghanistan justifies, in my view, the continuation of these annual Afghan lunches. We must not allow the sacrifices made by so many to be forgotten, or worse, disabused as a kind of false history. We came together today to remember and learn, but most importantly, to honor. For many people, Afghanistan may be in their rearview mirror, but for many others, things seen in the rearview mirror may be far more vivid and closer than what they appear to be. Thank you for your attention.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.